In the frost-bitten October of 1941, as Hitler's Wehrmacht juggernaut stood barely 40 kilometers from Moscow, the fate of the Soviet Union hung by the thinnest of threads. Threads ingeniously woven from plywood, canvas, and theatrical paint. While German reconnaissance planes photographed what appeared to be formidable defenses surrounding the Russian capital, they were actually documenting history's greatest military illusion. An elaborate phantasm of wooden tanks, painted Kremlin walls, and false battalions conjured by desperate Soviet magicians of war. This audacious deception, born at the intersection of military necessity and artistic genius, would ultimately halt the Nazi advance at Moscow's gates and reshape the entire Eastern Front. The dust clouds on the horizon moved like a medieval plague across the Russian steppes, but these harbingers of death wore field-grey uniforms and rode atop 3,000 German tanks. By October 2, 1941, Operation Typhoon, Hitler's final thrust toward Moscow, had shattered Soviet defensive lines with terrifying efficiency. General Heinz Guderian's panzer spearheads devoured 60 miles in a single day, their treads crushing autumn leaves and Soviet resistance with equal indifference. Wehrmacht officers, drunk on victory, began placing bets on which unit would first plant the swastika atop the Kremlin's ruby stars. Inside the Kremlin's bomb-reinforced bunkers, Stalin paced like a caged Siberian bear, his pipe smoke creating small clouds of nervous energy in rooms thick with desperation. The numbers arriving hourly from the front read like a military obituary. 663,000 Soviet soldiers captured or killed in just 10 days. Entire armies simply vanishing from existence, as government officials fled eastward on trains packed with industrial machinery and state archives. Moscow's citizens watched German reconnaissance planes circle overhead like mechanical vultures, photographing every street corner, every defensive position, every sign of life in a city that might soon become Europe's largest tomb. The capital's fate now rested not on the remnants of shattered Soviet divisions, but on a mathematical certainty that haunted every general staff meeting. Winter was coming, and Hitler's armies were still 40 kilometers too far from warmth, shelter, and victory. In this razor-thin margin between conquest and catastrophe, the stage was set for the most audacious gamble in military history, one that would transform Moscow into the world's grandest theater of war. In a commandeered theater workshop beneath the Bolshoi, surrounded by half-finished opera sets and the ghostly remnants of Swan Lake costumes, Colonel Boris Melnikov assembled the most unlikely military unit in Soviet history. The air reeked of turpentine and desperation as painters, sculptors, and stage designers, men who had spent their lives creating illusions for art, now found themselves tasked with crafting deceptions that could fool death itself. Melnikov, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War who understood that modern warfare was as much about perception as firepower, had convinced Stalin's inner circle that Moscow's salvation lay not in steel and concrete, but in the ancient arts of misdirection and camouflage. The recruitment process read like a fever dream. Cinematographers who specialized in forced perspective, theater directors who understood crowd psychology, and even magicians from Moscow's variety halls found themselves conscripted into what would become known as the Special Maskirovka units. Vladimir Petrov, a set designer who had created the winter wonderland for the Nutcracker, suddenly found himself calculating the shadow angles cast by fake artillery pieces. Dmitry Volkov, a portrait painter who had immortalized party officials in oils, now mixed pigments to make Soviet tanks disappear against autumn forests. These artists-turned-soldiers worked 18-hour days in freezing workshops, their hands raw from cold and chemicals, knowing that every brushstroke, every carefully placed branch, every precisely angled mirror might determine whether their city would see another spring. Stalin himself visited the workshops on October 15th, his suspicious eyes scanning the organized chaos of creative destruction. When Melnikov demonstrated how a plywood tank could fool observers from 200 meters, the dictator's granite expression cracked into something approaching a smile. "Comrade Melnikov," Stalin said, his Georgian accent thick with dark humor. "You artists have always been good at making people see what isn't there. Now we discover if you can make the fascists see what we need them to see." The transformation of Soviet deception from desperate improvisation to lethal precision began in the pre-dawn darkness of October 20th, when the first wooden T-34 rolled off its makeshift assembly line. Crafted from pine planks and theatrical canvas, these phantom tanks possessed an eerie verisimilitude that would have impressed Hollywood's finest prop masters. Each false vehicle required exactly 47 wooden components, meticulously shaped and painted to cast authentic shadows under German aerial reconnaissance. The artists had studied captured Wehrmacht intelligence photographs with obsessive detail, learning to see their creations through enemy eyes, understanding that a single misplaced rivet or poorly angled gun barrel could shatter the entire illusion. The mathematics of mass deception proved as complex as any military logistics operation. Teams of camouflage specialists spread across Moscow's defensive perimeter, creating phantom motorized divisions from nothing more than plywood, chicken wire, and theatrical genius. They constructed 1,500 dummy tanks, 600 false artillery pieces, and entire fabricated airfields complete with wooden aircraft that could fool German pilots from altitudes above 1,000 feet. Radio operators broadcast false communications between non-existent units, their voices crackling across the airwaves with reports of massive troop movements and supply convoys. The Phantom Army's headquarters featured elaborate tent cities with precisely choreographed foot traffic, extras in a deadly drama where a single missed cue could doom the entire production. But the masterpiece of Soviet theatrical warfare lay in the details that transformed mere props into living military installations. Engineers rigged heating systems beneath wooden tanks, creating thermal signatures that would register on German infrared detection equipment. Smoke generators produced the diesel exhaust of phantom engines, while hidden loudspeakers broadcast the mechanical symphony of a motorized division, grinding gears, rumbling engines, and the metallic clank of tank treads on frozen ground. As October's bitter winds howled across the Moscow approaches, German reconnaissance pilots photographed what appeared to be the largest concentration of Soviet armor in the war's history, never suspecting they were documenting the most elaborate magic trick ever performed under the guns of war. The most audacious act of urban camouflage in human history began with a single, revolutionary question. What if an entire capital city could simply disappear? As German bombers prowled the October skies above Moscow, Soviet engineers embarked on a feat that would have challenged the gods themselves, making the heart of the Soviet Union invisible to the Reich's most sophisticated reconnaissance technology. The operation commenced at the Kremlin, where teams of artists, armed with brushes and buckets of paint, transformed the fortress's iconic red walls into a canvas of deception, painting false windows, roof lines, and even entire phantom neighborhoods across the ancient battlements. The Kremlin's transformation represented perhaps the most surreal moment in Moscow's thousand-year history. Lenin's mausoleum vanished beneath a painted facade that resembled a modest residential building, complete with laundry lines and flower boxes. The towering spires of St. Basil's Cathedral were disguised as apartment blocks, their onion domes hidden under cunningly crafted wooden shells that cast ordinary shadows. Most remarkably, the Kremlin's walls themselves became a three-dimensional optical illusion. What German pilots saw from above was not the seat of Soviet power, but an unremarkable collection of workers' housing, indistinguishable from thousands of similar blocks across the city. Beyond the Kremlin, Moscow's industrial heart underwent an equally dramatic metamorphosis. The massive Kirov tank factory, visible from miles away, was draped in camouflage netting and painted to resemble a residential district, complete with false streets and phantom parks. Smoke generators created the illusion of domestic cooking fires rather than military production, while loudspeakers broadcast the sounds of children playing instead of the thunder of tank assembly lines. Workers arriving for their shifts walked through neighborhoods that existed only in the imagination of Soviet set designers, their daily commute transformed into a journey through the looking glass of military necessity. By November 1st, Moscow had achieved the impossible. A city of 4 million people had learned to hide in plain sight, its very existence becoming the Soviet Union's most closely guarded secret. In the sterile war rooms of Army Group Center, German intelligence officers hunched over aerial photographs that told a story too terrible to believe. Moscow bristled with fresh Soviet divisions like a hedgehog preparing for winter. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, the Wehrmacht's chief intelligence analyst on the Eastern Front, spread the reconnaissance images across his map table with the methodical precision of a pathologist examining a corpse. The photographs revealed what appeared to be the impossible: massive tank formations, artillery parks stretching for kilometers, and troop concentrations that suggested Stalin had conjured entire armies from the Siberian wilderness. The phantom evidence cascaded through German command channels with devastating effect. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, found himself staring at intelligence reports that painted Moscow as an impregnable fortress defended by forces that shouldn't exist. Radio intercepts captured frantic Soviet communications between phantom commanders coordinating the movements of non-existent divisions. Luftwaffe pilots returned with breathless accounts of enormous Soviet motorized columns moving under cover of darkness, columns that were nothing more than painted plywood and the fevered imagination of men flying through winter storms at 300 kilometers per hour. The ultimate triumph of Soviet deception came not in fooling Hitler's generals, but in convincing them to fool themselves. When presented with photographic evidence of Moscow's massive defenses, the Führer's strategic paranoia transformed tactical caution into strategic paralysis. On November the 2nd, Hitler issued the fateful order that would haunt the Reich for eternity. Army Group Center would halt its advance on Moscow and redirect forces to eliminate the phantom tank armies threatening the German flanks. 3 precious weeks that would have seen German forces in Red Square before the Russian winter bared its fangs, evaporated in pursuit of wooden ghosts and painted shadows. The steel columns that could have seized Moscow instead chased mirages across the frozen steppes, their fuel and momentum bleeding away in pursuit of an enemy that existed only in the fevered dreams of Soviet stage designers. The first killing frost arrived on November 7th, like a vengeful Cossack cavalry charge, transforming the Russian landscape into a crystalline death trap that would claim more German lives than any Soviet general could have dreamed. Temperatures plummeted from autumn's deceptive mildness to -20°C in a matter of days, turning Wehrmacht supply lines into frozen arteries of misery stretching back 800 kilometers to Poland. German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms and convinced Moscow would fall before Christmas, watched their rifles jam with ice, their tank engines seize like frozen hearts, and their carefully planned lightning war dissolve into a nightmare of frostbitten flesh and mechanical failure. The phantom Soviet divisions that had haunted German intelligence suddenly became irrelevant compared to an enemy that required no deception, an enemy that turned human breath into clouds of agony and transformed steel into brittle glass. Panzer crews discovered that their vaunted Tiger tanks, built for European battlefields, became death traps in the Siberian cold. Engine oil thickened to the consistency of molasses, hydraulic systems failed, and transmission gears shattered like crystal under the strain of subarctic warfare. Desperate German mechanics resorted to lighting fires beneath tank engines throughout the night, creating funeral pyres of machinery that could be seen for kilometers across the frozen wasteland. While German forces struggled against winter's relentless assault, Moscow's defenders found themselves blessed with the cruelest of allies. Soviet soldiers, equipped with felt boots and winter uniforms that had been stockpiled since October, moved through the snow like Arctic wolves stalking wounded prey. The city's camouflage units discovered that winter itself had become their greatest collaborator. Snowdrifts naturally concealed their wooden tanks, while blizzards rendered German aerial reconnaissance nearly impossible. By November's end, the Phantom Army had become unnecessary. The real enemy was no longer Soviet deception, but the inexorable mathematics of Russian geography and the calendar's remorseless advance toward the darkest months of the year. The trains that rolled westward from the Soviet Far East in late November carried more than just reinforcements. They transported the ghosts of a gamble that had reshuffled the global balance of power. For months, Stalin had played the most dangerous poker game in history, withdrawing battle-hardened divisions from the Manchurian border while Japanese forces massed just kilometers away. The intelligence coup that made this possible had arrived through the most unlikely of channels. Richard Sorge, a German journalist in Tokyo who was secretly Moscow's most valuable spy, had confirmed that Japan would strike south toward Pearl Harbor, rather than north, toward Vladivostok. The arrival of these Siberian divisions transformed the mathematics of Moscow's defense from desperate arithmetic to devastating multiplication. These were not the shattered remnants of earlier Soviet formations, but elite troops seasoned by years of border skirmishes with Japanese forces, men who had learned to fight in conditions that would have paralyzed European armies. General Andrei Vlasov's 20th Army, fresh from the Mongolian steppes, brought with them T-34 tanks that had been winterized for Siberian warfare, their engines equipped with heating systems that German engineers had never imagined necessary. More importantly, they brought the psychological steel of soldiers who had never known defeat. The phantom armies that had haunted German intelligence suddenly materialized into flesh-and-blood reality, but with a twist that would have impressed the most cynical theater director. The wooden tanks and painted artillery pieces were quietly dismantled and replaced with actual Soviet armor, creating the illusion that the deception had been real all along. German reconnaissance pilots, who had spent weeks photographing fake Soviet positions, now found themselves documenting genuine military installations in the exact same locations. The Maskirovka had achieved its ultimate triumph. The boundary between illusion and reality had completely dissolved, leaving German intelligence officers unable to distinguish between phantom threats and actual Soviet strength. By December 1st, Moscow's defenders possessed something more valuable than numerical superiority. They had become an army that their enemies could no longer accurately assess, count, or predict. At precisely 6 a.m. on December 5th, 1941, as the pre-dawn darkness cloaked the Moscow approaches in Arctic stillness, General Georgy Zhukov unleashed a thunderbolt that would reverberate across the frozen steppes and shake the Third Reich to its foundations. From positions that German intelligence had dismissed as lightly defended, Soviet artillery erupted in a symphony of destruction that caught the Wehrmacht completely off guard. Katyusha rocket launchers, their rails loaded with Stalin's organs of death, screamed across the winter sky in salvos that turned the night into a hellscape of fire and shrapnel. The psychological impact of the Soviet counteroffensive proved even more devastating than its tactical success. German soldiers, who had spent weeks staring at what they believed were phantom Soviet positions, now faced the terrifying reality that their intelligence had been systematically corrupted. The wooden tanks they had dismissed as props were replaced by actual T-34s, emerging from the snow like mechanical revenants. Tank crews who had been conserving ammunition for what they assumed were decoy targets suddenly found themselves engaging real Soviet armor at point-blank range. The Maskirovka had achieved its ultimate psychological victory. German forces could no longer trust their own eyes. Within 48 hours, the vaunted Wehrmacht war machine began to unravel like a cheap sweater pulled at the wrong thread. Entire divisions, weakened by weeks of winter warfare and demoralized by the apparent resurrection of the Soviet military, abandoned their positions in scenes that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. German officers watched in horror as their carefully planned defensive lines collapsed like a house of cards, revealing the terrible truth that their intelligence assessments had been built on foundation of theatrical smoke and mirrors. The retreat from Moscow became a rout, with abandoned German equipment littering the roads like metallic tombstones, marking the grave of Hitler's dreams of Eastern conquest. By December 15th, the city that had seemed within Hitler's grasp was 200 kilometers behind rapidly retreating German lines, its phantom defenders having achieved the impossible. They had transformed illusion into victory. The reverberations of Moscow's phantom victory rippled outward like shock waves from an earthquake, fundamentally altering the character of warfare on both sides of the Eastern Front. By spring 1942, Maskirovka had evolved from desperate improvisation into sophisticated military doctrine, with Soviet deception units becoming as essential to Red Army operations as artillery or armor. The lessons learned in Moscow's theater workshops spread across the vast battlefields of Russia, spawning phantom armies at Stalingrad, ghost divisions before Kursk, and entire fabricated offensives that would send German reserves racing toward empty steppes, while real Soviet forces struck elsewhere with devastating precision. The German response proved equally dramatic and far more paranoid. Wehrmacht intelligence, scarred by their Moscow humiliation, began treating every Soviet position as potentially fraudulent, every radio intercept as possible deception, every reconnaissance photograph as suspect. This institutional paranoia created a strategic paralysis that would plague German operations for the remainder of the war. Commanders who could no longer trust their intelligence became commanders who could no longer act decisively. Hitler's Eastern generals found themselves trapped in a maze of mirrors, where every Soviet move might be real or might be theater, where phantom threats commanded as much attention as actual ones. The mastery of military deception that began in Moscow's desperate autumn would ultimately reshape modern warfare itself. Allied intelligence officers studying Soviet techniques would later employ similar methods in the D-Day deceptions, creating phantom armies under General Patton's command that convinced Hitler to hold entire divisions in reserve against landings that would never come. The art of Maskirovka, born from paint and plywood in a besieged city's workshops, had become a permanent weapon in the arsenal of nations, proof that in warfare, as in theater, the most powerful truths are sometimes the ones that never existed at all. The wooden tanks that saved Moscow had taught the world that perception could be more powerful than steel, and illusion more deadly than reality. The final accounting of Moscow's phantom victory reveals a truth that would have delighted Sun Tzu and terrified Clausewitz. The greatest battles are sometimes won, not by those who fight most fiercely, but by those who understand most deeply the theater of the human mind. Hitler's failure at Moscow cost the Reich far more than territory or troops. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and transformed the Eastern Front from a war of conquest into a war of survival. The wooden tanks and painted walls that had fooled the Wehrmacht in October became the gravediggers of the Third Reich's Eastern ambitions, proving that plywood wielded by artists could accomplish what steel commanded by generals could not. The legacy of Moscow's Maskirovka extends far beyond the snow-covered battlefields of 1941, reaching into boardrooms where corporate executives study deception theory, into Silicon Valley laboratories where digital camouflage protects data instead of divisions, and into the shadowy world of modern intelligence where the distinction between truth and illusion remains as blurred as it was in those desperate workshops beneath the Bolshoi. Colonel Melnikov's theatrical warriors had discovered something profound about the nature of power itself. That reality is often less important than the story people choose to believe, and that the most devastating weapon in any arsenal is the ability to make your enemy see the world through your eyes, rather than their own.